should you play Indiana Jones and the Staff of Kings? The end of 2024 saw the release of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, and while it's not yet released on PS5, it has been released to critical and audience acclaim. But the Great Circle is far from the first Indiana Jones game. Mostly hailing from the late 80s to mid 90s, the last two big releases came from 2009. While we're not covering LEGO Indiana Jones 2 today, leave a comment below if you want to see a review of that, we are covering the other 2009 release, Indiana Jones and the Staff of Kings. So let's get into it and answer the question, should you play Indiana Jones and the Staff of Kings? Now, I hadn't really expected much from a tie-in game to an at the time 20-year-old franchise that was released on PS2 3 years into the life of the PS3. The development on Staff of Kings took almost 6 years, initially starting development for the PS3 and Xbox 360 before switching to the lower end consoles. Staff of Kings was announced in 2005 with an expected release of 2007, intending it to tie in with 2008's Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Staff of Kings ultimately missed that release window, and much of the team was moved to work on Star Wars The Force Unleashed, with a new team effectively starting from scratch. The game had been envisaged as being technologically advanced, with Industrial Light and Magic working on the lighting, and a physics system for puzzles that LucasArts would eventually get working for The Force Unleashed.
Long entrusted with the name and likeness of Dr. Jones, these sultans of software have just announced a new invention called Euphoria. This newfangled biomechanical AI will give the world a never-before-seen game experience. With Euphoria, players will get a new surprise every time they press a button. As this rare color footage shows, these thugs are no match for the pugilistic pounding of our intrepid hero.
When Naughty Dog's Uncharted released at the end of 2007, it achieved much of what LucasArts devs had wanted to achieve with Staff of Kings, effectively killing off the little enthusiasm left for the game. And, well, that kind of shows. The levels are linear and bland, essentially being a straight path to the end with few obstacles, barring a puzzle room or two in the middle and at the end. Maybe LucasArts could have gotten away with more linear levels had the game's set been dressed a little bit more interestingly. The paths you follow are often dull greys and browns with little flair and nothing to interact with outside of what is intended for minor puzzles and platforming. You might occasionally find an alternative path or an offshoot leading to a collectible that might unlock a new costume for Indy, trailers for all 4 films, or artwork for the game, but in either case the incentive to traverse these paths is not worth the effort you might take. The only times that platforming had anything resembling excitement to it were the QuickTime events that you would encounter. There are a good few number of these, enough to keep them interesting and restricted to moments that would actually make sense to use them. They were a little inconsistent in their difficulty though, some giving you a good margin of error and others requiring you to press the button basically at the moment it appears on screen to not fail. Again, you could kind of forgive this if the puzzle made it all worthwhile. I mean, that's the point of Indiana Jones, right? Figuring out the puzzle, solving the mystery with brain over brawn until the Nazis get in the way. Well, the puzzles were not exactly challenging either. The puzzles really are just fine, with difficulty ranging from the blindingly obvious levels of ease to stumbling through without any real challenge. I only had a couple of occasions where I didn't immediately waltz through a puzzle, the first time being a puzzle that involved moving a stone blocking flowing water that would change which of 2 hanging rocks could be swung and thus used to destroy an obstacle. It was clear what needed to be done, but it wasn't possible until I stumbled across the elusive button prompt to pick up the rock. The second time being where the game had set up something as being an option, only then to expect me to do the boring option instead. The bare bones of using the physics for the puzzles are there, but it's just clear that this is an over-ambitious system that was dropped before it was completed and then implemented in Force Unleashed. Another main aspect of the game is combat. It wouldn't be Indiana Jones without the ability to mow down Nazis. The first couple of levels have a bigger focus on combat before settling into the occasional segment in later levels. The combat itself then also comes in two distinct forms: melee combat that lets you use items in the world to attack your enemies, and ranged combat that takes the form of an on-rails shooter akin to something you would find in an arcade. Once more, neither are particularly challenging, especially once you have them figured out. Melee combat can be cheesed using Indy's whip, which disarms foes, dazes heavy enemies, and allows you to one-shot most other enemies. While shooting segments just require you to either destroy objects around the enemies for easy kills, or find the right spots to blast while the Nazis spawn in and run for cover. The shooting sections are actually really disappointing. Being on par with something you'd find in an arcade, it just means that they're dated, boring and slow. And that's all there is to the shooting sections, but the melee did have a little bit more to it, if you chose to ignore the whip's ability to make everything meaningless. The melee combat was clearly intended to have a bit of depth to it. Though it was ultimately released the same year, if it had met its intended 2007 release, I could see this as being a step on the way to the more fluid combat system seen in something like Arkham Asylum.
Kill him!
You have your light attacks, heavy attacks, dodge, grapple and whip. The combat actually gives you a lot of tools to play with combat areas being full of items to pick up and hit your enemies with, or throw at them, grapples allowing you to further use the environment to your advantage by positioning someone to drop scaffolding on them, or throwing them through a door, or into environmental items like tables or a fish tank. The system at times could actually be fun, and it gave the combat the frantic feel of an improvising underdog that the films have. It's a shame that this is all worthless when it's far quicker, safer, and more entertaining to just whip everyone to death. The shooting section does end up being the slightly deadlier of the two, requiring at least a small amount of timing to come out of cover without being hit yourself. The combat sections ended up being dull sections that felt forced to begin with, and then lasted far too long, quickly outstaying their welcome as tedious interjections to levels that are already slow and lifeless. The story actually does a decent job of replicating an Indiana Jones film, apart from maybe lacking the same level of charm and personality of the films. The plot sees Indy receiving a letter from an old friend explaining that Indy's college professor has gone missing. This sets in motion a series of events that sees Indy racing against his old rival Magnus Voller to prevent the biblical Staff of Kings from falling into Nazi hands.
Then by all means, Dr. Jones, explain.
Magnus Voller.
I see you already found what we were looking for. Thank you. You've saved us a lot of work.
What's the matter, Magnus? Can't go on digs without the Fuhrer's babysitters?
Sticks and stones, as you Americans say.
It's as standard as you might expect for an Indiana Jones story, and though it might be lacking in the personality department, it does a good job of hitting all the beats you might expect, with reimaginings of classic scenes and all the Indyisms. The story is unfortunately sparse though. It mostly serves as bookends to each of the levels, introducing the current location, or wrapping up that level and setting up the next one. There are cutscenes throughout the levels as things change or enemies spawn, and there is the occasional mid-level cutscene that will move the story forward, but these are few and far between and often double up as moving on to the next map within a level. By the time I got to the end of the story, I had realised that not much had actually happened, leading to the ending feeling a little rushed. It's not a particularly story-heavy game, and the main focus is on puzzles, exploration and combat, but I do think a more involved story would have really helped tie everything together better and would have created a stronger through line. There were a few other issues that reared their heads during my playthrough. Most notably was some audio issues that may be an unfortunate design choice, where background sounds were loud and on a constant loop. Thankfully confined to smaller spaces, it was nevertheless quite irritating to come across areas that greeted you with the constant screams of monkeys or clunky machinery. Other minor issues included some camera jank where the camera would freeze on a location instead of returning to follow Indy between camera angles, and an instance where a cutscene bugged out and froze, requiring to restart the level to rectify it. Indiana Jones and the Staff of Kings is a game that has little to show for almost 6 years of development. The Indiana Jones IP does its best to elevate the lackluster content, but even that isn't enough, instead merely highlighting how much better the game could have been. This is a game that by not playing, you won't be missing much. Given its litany of flaws and lack of any real redeeming features, this is unfortunately a strong avoid. It's not an awful experience by any stretch of the imagination, but it has very little going for it. I think a score any lower than a 4 would be somewhat harsh. So there we have it, Staff of Kings, a forgettable miss wearing the scars of overly long development, team swaps and unenthusiastic developers. If you like this review and want to see more, you can support the channel by either liking the video, subscribing, leaving a comment or joining the Discord linked in the description below. It all helps me out. Until next time, happy gaming!